This is Full Coffers with your host, Phil and Toni Buggs from Abundant Harvest Christian Fellowship Ministries.
And this week on Full Coffers, The Journey, Part 13. All right, I was thinking about it when it said The Journey, Part 13. And now I'm not a superstitious person, but
Why'd you bring it up?
What we're getting ready to talk about, 13, not a good sign.
Well, actually, it's interesting because, that'll be a nice play on words. This is 13, part 13. We're going to leave it right there, but you'll see the significance of part 13 as we enter.
I hope so,
this.
because
Yes.
I don't think what you were thinking was the same thing I was thinking. But anyway,
I know what you were thinking.
last time we talked,
No black
we
hats.
ended on the fact that you had become a minister,
Accepted my calling.
preacher,
Yeah.
man of the cloth, whatever you want to call it. And
Reverend.
also you had the opportunity to get the job of a lifetime. You had spent a number of years on the machine. You did some other things on the outside, but it kind of always ended up back on the machine. But this particular job in 97 was kind of a culmination of all you had learned thus far.
15 years into the trade.
Yeah.
That's what it was, 15 years.
And it was kind of like a dream job because it allowed you to travel to other manufacturing plants and companies, and everything that you had learned about machining and how to make parts and things, you were now training
People how to do it. I didn't really realize, it's that Daniel's son, Miyagi thing of wax on, wax off, but all that time God was preparing me from shop to shop, machine to machine, program to program.
layoff to layoff.
Layoff to layoff. Yeah, exactly, all of that. But during that time, I had acquired a wealth of knowledge on a lot of different machines. And I had the job that she's talking about. It was an applications engineer. First of all, real quick, didn't know what that was, but applications, it really talks about training others how to run those machines. So hidden behind training others was a gifting and talent that God had given me. That is being able to articulate high-tech information in layman's terms.
Yep. And the fact that you had a company car, you got to travel the whole Southeast region. It was a dream of a lifetime. Now, I must admit, this dream job came at the price of a whopping $15 an hour. Now, in today's standards, in 2020, that's minimum wage.
Just about.
But in 1997,
Yeah.
that was good pickings.
It was good picking for. I mean, it was 15 plus all the perks.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so that was kind of cool.
So, you know what? When you got that job, and I remember that same year, you weren't able to travel with the kids and I, but we went to a place called Marco Island, Florida. I drove about 14 hours by myself with the kids, and we just had a great time.
Yeah.
And you know what? We were beginning to live life. We were beginning to be a part of that middle class society. Weren't rich, still had some issues, paycheck to paycheck kind of thing. But we found ourselves beginning to enter the middle class life.
Yeah.
Unbeknownst to us, however, there was a storm a-brewing.
That crosses all socioeconomic boundaries.
And I think I alluded to it the last episode that way in the background, we saw the clouds coming, but, we figured maybe it'd pass us by.
Dun dun.
But it didn't. And what I'm talking about is teenagers.
Part 13. Teenagers.
While the last several episodes, we had not made mention of our children other than the birth of them, how they got here kind of thing.
The joy of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we've been relatively quiet about them. And for the most part, there really wasn't a whole lot to talk about other than them going through, entering school and playing in the streets. And we mentioned them briefly about them actually being one of the reasons why we wanted to relocate out of Detroit.
To give them a better upbringing.
Yeah, because they had
surroundings,
started to begin to recognize certain things about life in Detroit that we did not want them to go thinking that this
Is
was
normal.
life.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Hence the reason for going to Nashville. They had become accustomed, finally, it was a little bit of an adjustment, but they began to become accustomed to living in Nashville where they could have their bikes, leave them on the front lawn, and the next day
They'd
they
still
would
be
be
there.
there.
Yeah.
They could go to the next door neighbor's house who had a above ground pool and they can go swimming. Or they could go bike riding and stay for a couple of hours and we didn't worry about them.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
could go to spend the night with other friends and we didn't have an issue whether or not there was going to be, something that's going to happen. So we were entering what we call that middle class life. However, middle class doesn't mean you're exempt from raising teenagers.
We were naive about the comfort level that we thought that we were entering into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when Kyle, our daughter, she turned 13, really, Kyle never gave us a moment's worry at all. And we pretty much had a good relationship with both of our children. We were able to have conversations with them and we talked to them. Now, granted, they didn't tell us everything, and we knew that. That's probably why I looked at my daughter's diary a whole lot. But, black mama got to do what a black mama got to do.
We'll talk more about that.
But for the most part, Kyle was very quiet and unassuming, very shy and introverted.
We looked at, as we were raising our kids, there was a distinct difference between Kyle and Philip.
Yeah.
And if I say real quickly, the way that I probably coined it as a metaphor would be we would tell our kids what to do and what not to do. Kyle would take it, and if I say play in the backyard, don't go near the fence, Kyle would find her place right in the middle of that backyard, and there was no problem. Philip, on the other hand, had to find out what happens if I touch the fence.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, that pretty much pairs it up.
So in terms of personality,
they were different that way.
They were direct opposites
Definitely
of each other.
different. Yep.
Kyle's teachers would say, hey, I wouldn't even know if she's in the room if I didn't look up and see
That's
her.
it.
And that was Kyle. So for the most part, Kyle was very unassuming, very cooperative young woman. And as she went from, her preteens to teenage years, we went through the normal, things about it. And when she became a teenager, to 13 or whatever, the question of boys would occasionally come into the conversation.
Dun, dun.
Not that she was, constantly asking us about boys and all of this, but we had, decided to.
And it is we.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We said, okay, this is the way it's going to work because let's face it, we were going on what we were taught by our parents.
That's true. Now, I must admit, while Toni says we, I actually took the lead in. No, did we do? No, we agreed with this together.
Collectively
Yep. At first,
that when she turned 14,
that's true.
She would be allowed to have phone conversations with boys.
That's true.
Limited, of course, but she'd have them. And when she turned 16, she would be allowed to date. Now, mind you, don't forget when I was talking about Philip and I dating, I was 14 years old, but my daughter didn't know that at the time because I didn't want her necessarily to date at 14. So we said at 16, you can date.
Now, what did we understand dating to be when we said that?
Dating to us, as far as we knew, was,
right.
If you had a boyfriend that you were exclusive, back in the day we said going together, meant that, we were just seeing each other.
And no one else.
No one else. So we would go out to movies or McDonald's or wherever, one-on-one, by ourselves, alone.
Right.
And so that's what we had kind of conveyed to our daughter. And she was okay with it. Now, every now and then she would say, well, there's a party or whatever, but we still didn't feel comfortable with the teen parties is what they called it. But we had told her, when you turn 16, you can begin to date. Okay, fast forward to age 15 and a half. Now, to set up this play, remember, Philip had become a minister.
In 97.
And Kyle was going to turn 16 in...
99?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I can't do the math right now.
That's right.
So,
Hey y'all, Kyle here. The one that they're talking about. Just want to clarify that I actually turned 16 in the year 2000, not 99. I was born in 84. 99 is close enough, but I just want to put that out here. Okay, back to the story.
he had about 2 years to kind of position himself in his calling and learning some things. And he's just reading books and soaking up knowledge. And there was one book in particular that he really, because I have to say this about Philip. He's not necessarily a reader unless he absolutely has to. But he seemed to pick up this particular book. And I will let Philip tell you about this book.
Well, the book was called I Kissed Dating Goodbye by a guy named Josh Harris. Now, this is 2020 we're speaking here, but if I can, I have to go back to when the book was out in late 90s and the impact that it had on the culture when it came out. It was new, and I understand that there's been a lot of revelation about that series of books that has changed over the year. But at the time it was brought out, it was radical. It was radical in that, and this is a Christian author, young man, and he really looked at the idea of dating versus courtship. And the dynamics between the two intrigued me because when Toni and I were dating, there were definitely some walls, some areas that we, if I say tripped up in, that I didn't want for my children. So Philip goes through this radicalized, and I have to say it like that. If I say naivety, it was naivety, but it was honest intent.
Well intent. It had good intentions.
Good intentions.
And
I'll just
the delivery sucked. Because
I didn't know.
Where's Cedric the entertainer when you need him?
But I took this and I said, wow, this is how, we're supposed to do it.
Let's explain to the audience.
So I'm about to get into that. Yeah. So dating, obviously, what happens when you date is that, I don't have to explain that. Pretty much when you go out and you date. Physical attraction is there. I'm just going to lay it on the line. And the gushy stuff is right up front. Well, the premise of the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, was to flip that to what they call courtship, where the intent is to start learning about the person from a biblical perspective. And again, I'll just put it right out there. So the idea is not dating 101, dating one-on-one. That exclusive dating is a trap because what it does, it focuses in on the wrong aspects of what you should be looking for in if I say life partner by today's standards, back then as a husband or wife. Understanding the intent of courtship is to find your wife or husband. So that was, okay, yeah, I get that. With Toni and I, when we started dating, I was looking at her as a wife. Maybe not when I first saw her, but the intent was exclusiveness to focus in on who I wanted as a mate. So all that said, so Josh Harris had this radical change to dating called courtship, where you would never date one-on-one. It would have to be groups. And in fact, there was more emphasis on you becoming familiar with the person outside of the social one-on-one environment. So getting to know family, getting to experience them outside of that one-on-one setting, whether it was church, playing baseball, just activities where you learn the person's character. So that's what I said, wow, great. Let's do this.
Now, conceptually, that sounds like a good thing. Conceptually is the key word.
And you know what I did? I had this gigantic Prince cruise line roaring down the ocean in the mind of our daughter, Kyle. And I decided to turn that big ocean liner 180 degrees and felt that, hey, we can do this.
Now,
and I turned it.
I warned him before. I said, I don't fully agree with this concept for a couple of reasons. One, we had not prepared Kyle for this change.
No, we hadn't.
In all fairness to her, we told her,
Yep.
when you're 16, you can begin dating. We didn't break it down to say group dating or anything.
Nope.
Had we done that early on, the information that we conveyed to her wouldn't have been as dramatic as
True
it
that.
was.
Yes. Yeah.
But Philip, and remember, we had the conversation about who was going to lead our family. That was
true.
my husband. And so even though I did not agree with doing this, it wasn't so much I disagreed with the concept. I mean, yes, Philip and I can tell you a million times how many times we probably should not have been alone. But I disagreed with how we were going to convey this to our daughter. And her being 15 and a half. And by then, there was a couple of boys that, she probably could be interested in.
Yeah.
And we were going to just lay this on her just like that. And that was the part I vehemently, yeah, disagreed with.
I get it.
But because Philip was the leader of our home and I committed, shut up. We're not working on nouns and pronouns now.
She keeps slipping back. I have to remind her. This isn't past tense.
But I had to submit to his decision. And we, as a couple, went to our daughter
Right.
after he fully understood what the concept was, and we sat our daughter down.
And of course, our daughter said, "Wow, Dad, I never thought about it like that. I thought for sure I'd have a Mike Brady Bunch moment where Marcia would say, I never thought about it like that." Not.
No.
Talk about the Jaws music in the background. That shark was about to come out full blown because, unbeknownst to us, Kyle had started to like boys in a very romantic way. And what was happening that there were, and it's not like any other young person.
Yeah, she was attracted to young men.
Yes, and which is natural.
Right.
The problem that I didn't see was, how do you put toothpaste back into the tube when it's out?
Yeah.
And I had started that when I said she could date at 16. So, truthfully, there was no way that I could have implemented that as quickly as I tried. And again, well-intentioned, and I must admit that I slipped back into some, if I say old paramilitary parenting tricks or techniques, which was...
Translation is my way of the highway. That's how that conversation ended.
And Kyle, as well as I'm sure a lot of young people will see about that. Mm-hmm. And so when I did that, obviously, there was a definite, it wasn't audible or she didn't immediately say, no, I don't want to do that. She shut down.
She did.
I think
and first
that's
of all, like
I
said, we had conversations with our children about a variety of things. So it wasn't like they were totally afraid of talking to us.
Right.
But I do know they were very selective,
Right.
like most kids, teenagers are going to be with their parents.
Right.
We have always tried, and times we have failed, but we have always tried to have an open communication with our kids. We really tried because we were raised in my home. My mother is like, you, before you even get the question out, is no. There was no negotiation,
Right.
even though I kind of did what I needed to do. But anyway, but the respect was still there. When I knew she meant no, it was no, and
Right.
that was it. And it was no negotiating. There was no coming back to the negotiating table.
Right.
It was just no.
If I say on my side of the table, with Willie and Sam, my parents, it was like, I told you what it was going to be, if I came and asked them again, for instance, if I got in trouble and had to do the dishes for the rest of the week, if I came back before that seventh day and says, can I get off? My mom would say, just for that, you got it for a month. Oh, you know. So
So
on
we
my
were,
side, yes, we
yeah,
were very,
we tried. We really
yes,
tried to
yes,
not,
change. But the problem with me, if I say I went back because I only knew what I knew. So my parenting skills, unfortunately, had not evolved to be able to react to that new information in a better way. Had I had that information, the information I know now, back then I would have approached it differently. That said, on the flip side, if I say it like this, our children had a responsibility to do as their parents told them.
yeah.
They have a responsibility, and that I don't shy away from. Yes, what I suggested was wrong, but I do say it like this, on Kyle's front, she was completely against that mindset. Truth be told, that was probably the better way to navigate through it, but there were some things that Kyle, how do I say this?
Well, what I'll say is
Yeah,
after that conversation concluded, and it was concluded by mostly us talking and her being
listen,
quiet.
yeah,
Again, typical teenage behavior. The whatever door that we had access to with her had closed.
yes,
I think if I can speak on her behalf is that she was disappointed in the decision that was made. She probably felt that it was unfair because all along, up until this point, we had told her something else. And she probably, just said, this is not going to work for me. And she wasn't a rebellious child in terms of, talking back or anything like that. But what she did was probably worse than talking back.
she
And as
shut
Philip
down.
said, she shut
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
And like I said, whatever door we had access to her, it was totally closed, locked. And I think in some ways she probably felt somewhat of a betrayal. Now, can I say that my daughter's intentions, without putting all her business in the street, because she actually edits these things for us, but can I say her intentions were pure about why she wanted to go? Probably not, but no different than Philip and I, you and I. I can't say when we went on a date the intention was to do what we did, but
I can say it.
yeah.
I never planned it, but if it happened, okay.
Exactly.
But
So
that was it, yeah.
And I know that Philip's whole point of doing this was to protect her, preserve her purity.
But I think, I must admit, it's and I know we're cutting each other off because we want to get this stuff in. The standard is not, and I think that's another thing, the standard of Christian living is not each other. The standard of Christian living is what is right, regardless of who the messengers are that are delivering the message. The standard doesn't drop to a curve to say, well, your mama did it, so why can't I?
No, and I
I think
wasn't alluding to
no,
that.
No, I didn't think you were. I just needed that need to be brought out that with Kyle's resistance to us was more a resistance or a rebellion against the faith that we grew up in. I'll pause right here.
Yeah, and you said the word rebellion, and I'm trying to get him out of the king's language because of that.
Okay, let me speak plain language. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to do what was right.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
Let's just break it down.
Exactly.
She didn't want to do what was right.
We had certain parameters in our life, and no joke, it all aligns itself with our Christian faith. And we know that, sex before marriage is not of God, and that's what we were trying to prevent. That's what I believe Philip's intentions were. That's what I believe that Josh guy's intentions was. Like I said, I never disagreed with the concept necessarily. I disagreed with how we had conveyed it to Kyle.
I wholeheartedly agree with your statement of implementation.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I have to make a distinction that whether the Catholic nun told you not to run in the hall and you ran, or she rapped you on the wrist and you stopped running in the hall, what was the intent? Not to run in the hall. You could listen and do it, or you could get rapped on the knuckles and do it.
Actually, it was my ankles, but anyway.
But
that really happened.
But if you see what I'm getting
yeah,
at there,
yeah.
is that still, it really comes down to what is the rule and what is the response.
And I think what we're trying to convey,
and I'm glad we're jostling back and forth, because even as parents of grown kids, and we're looking at this in the past, there's still, as the audience can tell, even as we are dialoguing now, there's still some differences, and that's okay. But we still work through it and understand it the best. We want the best as it relates to our faith and as it relates to us as parents and our kids. So yes.
And at the end of the day, as we kind of come to a conclusion of this, is that we made mistakes in certain areas with our kids, but the intention is always giving them the opportunity to live a wonderful life. Everything that we wanted to instill in them from our Christian faith has always been to encourage them, motivate them, allow them to see what living a Christian life could afford them.
Right.
Unfortunately, however, when we told Kyle that this was going to be the color of the day, the way she shut down wasn't just, a moment in time. She shut down for 2 years.
Yep.
And so when we talk about this from the past, I think if I were to talk to parents of teenagers now who want to instill their values in their children, there's a way to do it. And I think most importantly, the takeaway is talk to your children and prepare them early. If you have a certain value system or moral system or faith system that you want your children to learn how to embrace, you have to start early. Philip and I talked about something a couple of days ago that I thought was a little fascinating, is that whenever we traveled, and we used to travel in our cars a lot because airline tickets, we just, no. But one of the things we did when we traveled is we played gospel music in the car. I mean, even though I'm an R&B fan and Philip's a jazz fan, but we always played gospel music.
Cassettes.
And, yes, cassettes.
Lots of cassettes.
But the thing about it, we discovered just recently, our daughter Kyle, when she goes to work, she says, I listen to Fred Hammond, or I listen to Hezekiah Walker, Kirk Franklin. Yeah. With our son Philip, there's certain Fred Hammond songs that he likes. So even though they may not have embraced a lot of, and we can talk about that later, a lot of our faith system, there were things that we did early on in an early age that they gravitated to, and they still exhibit or feel or go to those, I don't even know what the word is, but they go to those songs,
Right.
But again, I guess what I'm trying to say again is that if there's something that you want your children to instill in them, you have to start young.
I agree.
And start talking to them young so that they're prepared for what it is, or the expectation, they understand what your expectation as a parent is.
I agree. That's solid. That's solid advice. For me, and if I say the takeaway, one of the things I learned that if I had it to do over again, and this is advice or counsel for parents who are going through what we're going through, and maybe you had a strict parent that emulated what I had done and the errors or the outcome of it initially. One of the things I wish that I could have been softer on was giving Kyle an opportunity to fail.
Yeah.
I think that in all of that, I was so busy trying to keep her from falling. She held out, and she failed after she was out from under our care. Because one of the things that I did say was, while you're in this house, you will obey. And that she took that literal.
Took it and ran with it.
But as soon as she was from under our care.
Can you spell buck a while?
Technical difficulties.
Again, if there's anything that I would instruct or advise parents to do who really want their children to not ever fall. They have to fall.
Right. And I
But
think that was Kyle's complaint for the most part.
We
never did trust
her. And I do see now, I never gave her the opportunity to fail.
Right.
And as a parent, we have, if the child's going to learn what's right, we have to be there when they fall and trust them to be open enough to let us know what's going on.
Yeah, and trust your own teaching. You know, if you think it's so right, then why don't you put it to the test?
Exactly. And if they fall, we can then correct that, or hopefully, and that's the one thing. Second thing is our children have a choice. And I think that once they get from underneath our teaching, they have to decide for themselves what kind of life they're going to live without us, if I say pressuring them. They have to. This Christianity that Toni and I talk about, that I live, breathe, and love, is something that thank you, dear, something that we did voluntarily. I heard the phrase, God doesn't have grandchildren. Every person that comes into a relationship with Christ, they do it on their own, voluntarily, and they embrace it. I say that from a parental standpoint, that while you're teaching your children, and that phrase or that scripture in the Bible, train up a child in the way in which they should go, and when they old, they will not depart. Trust that. My brother said it best, my older brother. When I was going crazy about Kyle and Philip just not doing right, he said, Philip, what you've instilled in them is still in them. That is why our kids gravitate toward listening to gospel music when they need uplifting, because that stuff works. So, rounding this out, want to just have that takeaway on my side, that let them fail while they are in the house so you can pick them up.
All right, then. Well, we're going to round this out, and we will catch you on the other side.
This episode was produced and edited by Miss K. Simone. Cover graphics by Indefinite. Music by Miss K. Simone. So until next time, I'm Phil Bugs.
And I'm Toni Bugs.
Wishing you a wonderful week.